Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's conversation. Today is World Habitat Day. Since 1985, the first Monday of October has been dedicated as a day to reflect on the state of our towns, cities, and the adequacy of housing and shelter for all. So a fitting day to continue this Habitat for Humanity Plus You series, where over the last few months, special guests and experts join us for conversations on important topics that intersect closely with housing. Past conversations have focused on health and housing, racial discrimination in housing, urban informal settlements, and much more. I believe the YouTube chat is going to contain some links just so everybody has access to those archives. I'm Patrick Kelly. I lead Habitat for Humanity's Terwilliger Center for Innovation and Shelter. We facilitate local market-based solutions to affordable and better housing. So Habitat is deeply interested in the ability of local markets to meet the housing needs of low-income populations. So needless to say, we are in challenging times. With a slumping global economy, the IMF is predicting near double-digit reductions in economic growth in many countries. So not only will housing take a hit, many sectors of the economy are stagnating, creating losses of jobs and livelihoods. So today, we are talking about the release of a report recommending that economic stimulus to COVID-19 from governments around the world contain a focus on housing and affordable housing. So the report makes the case that including a focus on housing will help us address the global public health crisis at hand, as well as drive economic recovery, growth, and the recreation of jobs. So one of the authors of that report, Maria Hoch-Smit from the University of Pennsylvania, is here with us today. And we're going to get to those findings in the report, as well as get some commentary from some other amazing panelists that we have here today. Before doing so, I would like to invite you all to use the YouTube chat to leave questions that you may have. We are going to try to reserve some time at the end of the hour to address as many of those as we can. So let's get started. We've got some guests from emerging markets. And to get a good sense of the state of the housing sector and the economy, let's first jump to India and Deval Monani.
Good morning, Patrick. So, Patrick, when we look at the state of the housing sector in India, we've seen a massive slowdown. Over the last 6 years, India has been going through a massive building phase where the Prime Minister's office has been instrumental in building a target of 20 million homes, and they've achieved around 3.5 million. Since the slowdown, this pace has just stagnated off. And in some sense, they have realized that the deficit in India is rental as well as ownership. But contrary to putting money into the housing sector, the onus has been on spending more on large industry, and this is because overall economic activity in India has slowed down dramatically compared to any other major economy. I think we're some 29% down on the quarter, and you can see it especially in the construction sector, in the lower ends of society, in the manufacturing sector, and housing and housing services take up around 9% of GDP in India, and we are seeing a massive contraction in it. So unless we see some major push coming in, we are seeing the economy taking a big hit in India.
Thanks, Deval. Ariel, your perspective from Mexico?
Yes, good morning. Good morning to everyone. More or less the same. Maybe the difference in Mexico is that we, in the overall performance of the economy, more than 60% is informal. So the lockdown was very severe for this segment. People was not able to keep in homes without working and without having any wage. So this is a difficult situation, but also in addition, we have a lot of overcrowding in homes, and we have also proved a statistically significant positive correlation between deaths by COVID-19 and overcrowded homes. So we don't only have the economic impact, we also have the sanitary impact because of the situation of the houses. Overcrowding in Mexico is around 99% of all homes, implying 41% of national population.
Patrick, if I may just add a little bit on that. In India, we actually, just when the pandemic struck, we did a paper on how the pandemic will affect slums, and we realized that due to overcrowding, every infected person in a month infected 22 people, and that led to huge amounts of problem in the bottom of the sector. And like I just mentioned briefly previously, that because the government has not been focusing on housing, and even they came up with a rental policy which was completely geared towards PPP rather than the government spending, we are seeing nobody addressing this problem. And you have slums in India which have one toilet for 1,500 people. So we see that as a massive area where the government should step in, housing for these sectors. But unfortunately, the priorities, at least in India, are very different right now.
Thank you both for setting that context for us. So let's go to Philadelphia, where we have Maria Hochschmidt from the University of Pennsylvania. Maria, tell us about your findings and recommendations in this report. And Maria, I think you are muted.
Yeah, I begin again. Sorry. It's a great pleasure to present the findings of this report, which I did together with my colleague Arthur Akole and of the University of Washington. And to present this at this fantastic time and on Habitat Day is a great pleasure. In my work in emerging markets, I have often found that the scope and scale of the housing sector for the economy is not at all well understood, and it has translated often in a lack of policy attention in many countries for the housing sector. So now that COVID has put the overcrowding conditions and poor housing conditions right in the center of the attention, it is important to highlight also the economic contribution as well as the health contribution of housing. So that is what we set out to do in this report, to show the importance of the sector in both crises that we face, the health crisis and the economic crisis in many countries. And the housing sector can play an enormously important role in the recovery process. So what we are finding in the report from 11 countries, we only had time to do the calculations for 11 countries, but they represent a wide variety, all regions of the world. We will show you a graph later on of the countries that we have. We see that housing contributes to the GDP, and we should talk about that first, in two important ways. Housing, of course, is represented in the GDP of a country through housing investment calculations, the gross fixed capital formation, as we call that, which contributes normally in the range of 2 to 6% to the GDP of a country. often that is the focus of the calculation of housing contributions to GDP. But we often miss out on another very important aspect of the housing sector in the GDP calculations, and that is housing services or the consumption of housing. So that is basically measured as the expenditures that households make for their housing in rent or in imputed rent, as we call it, what an owner would have to pay in rent if he were renting his own house. Those contributions, because the housing stock is so much larger than the new construction, that contribution to GDP is actually much larger, in the order of 5, 6 to 15% in most countries. So, but that both of these in emerging markets, both of these indicators are often very poorly measured. So housing investment excludes nearly always the entire informal sector or part of it, and also the own account building by homeowners themselves. Housing services is often totally excluded. We don't know what housing services, what housing consumption contributes to GDP in many countries. So if we can have the info, the first infographic, we can see these contributions, the relative contributions of investments in housing and the consumption of housing. So if that's up, so we can see that there is enormous variety, and that's most likely across countries, and that is most likely due to the noise in the data. And you can also see that in the dark bar, not the orange bar, that is what we have mostly for all countries. That is the investment in housing. But the social contribution, the consumption contribution, is often missing in many countries, as you can see. So GDP, in short, therefore, is the housing contributions to GDP is often undercounted drastically, particularly in emerging markets, where the informal sector both delivers a lot of construction as well as housing services. So the upshot of all of this is the total contribution of housing, the housing sector to GDP, is in the order of 13 to 18%. In some countries that go through a growth spurt, an urbanization spurt, it is often higher. Compare that to the US, that is at the same time, in the same time, roughly 14.6%. So it is on par with sectors like manufacturing and other important sectors of the economy, but it is not receiving that much attention in economic recovery plans. And that is of great concern, particularly when housing plays such an important role at the moment in the COVID crisis, in the health and well-being of the entire population. So despite the economic growth potential, we do not see the attention that it deserves. That is the conclusion of the report on the data side.
Thank you, Maria. And we have a guest who is at an institution focused very much on economic growth. So Deborah, could you share a little bit about how DFC thinks about housing?
Sure, definitely. Thank you, Patrick. I have been with OPIC for nearly 20 years, and 10 years ago, housing was a priority sector for us when we were called OPIC, by the way, and now we're called DFC, the United States International Development Finance Corporation. And our focus is, as you said, economic development in emerging markets in support of US foreign policy, but also through private sector investment. So the challenge for me over the last 10 years has been how to grow our pipeline out of the global economic crisis, when we had probably $1 billion pipeline and portfolio 10 or 12 years ago. But of course, the crisis had a significant impact on anything in the real estate space at that point. And I would say that our biggest challenge has been to find entities that are able to deliver housing, what I would say in the right way. I mean, we understand that the impact, because housing is essentially the focal point for everything that's meaningful for a family, everything that on which the welfare of a family depends: health and security and education, community engagement, civil society, faith, all of those things, even job creation, self-employment, oftentimes centers around your housing circumstances. And I agree with Maria. It's very, very difficult for us to measure that. We just know it intuitively. And so we've worked hard to find companies who can deliver on all of those benefits. But it's not that easy. I think that's part of our challenge, delivering housing in the right way, from the Gaia perspective of the full community and all of the aspects that surround that family, is difficult to do. It's difficult in emerging markets, and we clearly have our own challenges here in the US. So I would say DFC, we continue to want to support housing, but I think what it helps us do in particular is deliver on our other priorities in the healthcare sector, for example, and security, resilience, green, sustainable, built environment, and housing is key for all of those agendas.
Thank you, Deborah. I do want to spend a moment just talking a little bit about that informal sector. Several have mentioned that, and this is a topic that is really near and dear to our hearts at Habitat. So many people we have found are not buying a home that's been built. They're not using a mortgage. They don't have access to that. Typically, they have informal work, so they don't have documented pay stubs, and they are therefore unable to go to formal financing mechanisms for their housing. So actually, if we could get I think there's a second graphic that we were going to put up. So this actually shows how vast some of these sectors of the housing market can be. Some of the statistics we have on this are that in many countries, upwards of 70% or more of the population actually don't buy a home. They sort of build through this incremental, informal market way. And so typically that has not even been captured when housing statistics can be captured. And so a big thanks to Madia and Arthur for doing their best to estimate this sector and to quantify it, and to show that it even I would say amplifies the impact that housing makes on a market or on an economy. So I'd love to, Madia, if we could go back to you and if you could talk a little bit more about that in your recommendations.
Yeah, so the housing sector, of course, if you create a stimulus around the housing sector, it works its way through the economy, through employment generation, basically. That is how it does it. And the informal sector and home improvement type housing actions are a lot more labor intensive than the large scale construction. But both, of course, contribute through creating employment, and that is so critical when you have an economic crisis. So to create critical also because you can employ, and you do employ in the construction sector, many unskilled laborers or small firms, particularly in the informal economy. Many small contractors contribute to construction. Also, housing has what we call a bit of an awkward word, but a multiplier effect. When you create new housing or you make extensions, you affect employment in other and production in other sectors of the economy. You need furniture, you need appliances, and so on and so forth. So housing also has that multiplier effect on the economy. And lastly, it's very important, housing is very important to stimulate the economy because it can leverage very much the private sector resources and household resources. Also, if we do our job well, it can leverage international organizations like Debbie was talking about. So that's very important on how these stimulus packages can work. And of course, for the population, as we all have said, housing has all these enormous benefits: social, health, education, the productivity of labor. So housing is actually very critical in its output for the economy and for the household sector. But stimulus packages are very difficult to create. As Deborah already mentioned, how do you do this in short term? You have a crisis now. The crisis hopefully will not last forever, although the economic downturn may last, of course, a couple of years after we take care of the health crisis. Nevertheless, housing has a long gestation period. It takes a long time to create new housing projects. So what can you do in the short term when the sectors of the economy, of the housing sector that you want to reach are in fact very inefficient? So the housing market is mostly efficient only at the top of the market, and that not even always. But at the bottom of the market, where we want to reach because of the households affected by economic downturn and health situations, often lack property rights. Very small scale housing finance sectors. We have no risk mitigation institutions for the financial sector to provide developer finance, to provide finance to landlords who want to invest in rental housing. So how do you do that in the short term? That's an enormous challenge for governments and one that many struggle with. So what we often see happening is that countries want to stimulate the housing market because they know it's important and can create employment, but the government policies are targeted towards the top end of the market that already functions. And in many cases, houses are not needed. We already have vacancies in the top end of the market. So that is the challenge, and we miss out on focusing on the lower income parts of the market, where these funds that we employ would have a much larger impact on the economy and on consumption. So that is the challenge that we are facing. In the report, we don't only talk about the challenges of doing that, but about some of the options that governments, both local governments and national governments, might look for to get this stimulus started in the shorter term. So we only give general recommendations. It's a short report. If it was too long, we would not have the readership that we wanted. So we only give some general recommendations on what to do in the land sector, how to use land resources that a local government already has at its disposal. Many local governments sit on a lot of land or have land, can make land available, plots available in service location that are tax delinquent and that can be reutilized. And so look at those resources and then try to leverage those together with the private sector, do auctions for that land, create community land trusts with trusted NGOs and capable NGOs to bring that land to the market in short term. You do not need new infrastructure for that. Ultimately, of course, you want new land to be opened, but that is a longer term proposition for the entire market. In the housing finance sector, we face the same problem. We need finance. We cannot mobilize the housing sector if people cannot pay for housing. If developers, and you cannot pay for housing from savings, you need, in most cases, some loan, a small loan, a large loan, it depends on what you are doing. So developers need finance, landlords need finance. So, and that is often not available for the lower end of the market. So scaling up the institutions that we already have available, like microbuild, very important. We talk about it later on, so I will not dwell on it. But it is basically a debt fund that is available for micro lenders. We have a similar type of institution in many countries that is called a liquidity facility to make debt finance available for mortgage lenders. So use all of those and create new institutions if they can facilitate financing, like mortgage insurance or insurance for the lenders to deal with the informal sector, which is very important because employment, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, is from 60 to 80% informal. And that is very difficult for a mortgage lender to deal with. So create guarantees that can be put in place in the shorter term. On the third aspect that we emphasize is that nearly always some form of subsidy is required. Subsidies for households to be able to pay for the housing that is produced, and also for lenders very often, or for developers to make sure that they can build efficiently for that broad, middle and lower income sector of the market. So many countries have tried to do this, but it is not very easy. And so, you know, we will later on talk a little bit about what we can do to help governments do it right, because it's very complicated. So that is all I want to say here, Patrick.
Thank you, Maria. That is really helpful. So I want to move to Ariel, who is very unique in the private sector with a storied public career in the housing ministry in Mexico. Ariel, how is the public and the private coming together in Mexico, and is it working?
Well, supporting the housing sector with federal financing and subsidy programs has been definitely a successful, proven countercyclical public policy to reactivate domestic demand in crisis environments. That was the case during the tequila crisis in 1994 and the subprime mortgage shock in 2008. So a relevant conclusion was to allocate the federal budget to actual housing demand. I mean, first home, because the subsidy, even if it is for buying a home, which is more the formal sector, or self-construct a home, which is more or less the informal sector, the difference is between buying or self-constructing or not. If you do not allocate efficiently that budget, maybe the difference will be to buy or to self-construct a cheaper, a more expensive house than a cheaper one. So maybe that's the greatest experience. Definitely is a correct initiative from the government. And right now in Mexico, a current administration is planning to provide upfront subsidies for self-construction, but directly to the beneficiary in order to disintermediate. Maybe this is maybe this try to address the very short term. Maybe conceptually is totally correct, but in my opinion and my experience, we should be aware of many things. For example, if self-construction is not accompanied by a technical assistance, formal technical assistance, you are taking the risk to build in risk areas which are not controlled locally by local governments. Also, you need to take care of structural design to assure structural security, and maybe also to make the investment more efficient in order to how to distribute the house. If you need 2 rooms, one room, etc. So I agree with Marja. This is very difficult in the short term. Maybe this initiative in the Mexican government right now to provide money for self-construction is correct, but it's not that easy. And in my opinion, technical assistance is a must, and you cannot go without the market. Always the market is going to be there, and you need to bring it. And maybe you need to control differently, but you cannot go alone. That's a reflection from the Mexican experience by now.
Thanks, Ariel. So let's go to the private sector. Deval, you are a developer making some of the most affordable and innovative houses in India. Talk a little bit about the enabling environment and how is the government helping you or hindering you from doing that?
So, one very interesting thing that India has been successful in is setting up a very robust housing finance market for the informal sector. And in India, you will find this trickling down to what we call tier 4 cities, which are a little more than villages, and to people who are vegetable vendors or street side vendors. So I think Indian government has been especially successful in that. And second, they have been very, very successful in enforcing a very interesting subsidy scheme, which they call the credit linked subsidy scheme, which basically says they subsidize your interest rate on a 15-year mortgage to the tune of 6.5% for a maximum of X amount, and they give it to you upfront. Now, what it does, it gives the beneficiary the benefit of either self-building the house or going to a developer and buying from him, and he can it's only applicable for first time buyers. So this has been, I think, one of the biggest successes of governments. And for developers, it's a direct subsidy, so effectively their homes are, if you put it in dollar terms, something like $4,000 cheaper, and it goes, and there is no leakage because it happens via a bank or a housing finance company mortgage. So I think that has been pretty revolutionary for the Indian housing market for the last in the last 6 years. And if you see the data, India is one of the unique markets. I say maybe not as unique as Mexico in that way, but 60% of all loans dispersed are for self-built homes. So even after becoming quite mature as a market, we still see self-built and horizontal homes being the go-to for the low-cost housing sector. And these are very recent numbers. I'm talking about 2018-19. As a developer, what apart from these things, the environment is pretty harsh. The regulatory environment in India is maybe some of the toughest in the world. It doesn't encourage a lot of entrepreneurs getting into it, which I feel would really define if the government started making regulations keeping in mind entrepreneurs in the sector rather than established legacy players.
Thanks, Deval. That's helpful. So both Ariel and Deval and Maria have shared a little bit about just that informal sector, the low income borrowers or home builders. So Deb, going back to you and the DFC, how does the DFC think about that part of the market?
We would very much like to do more in that very low income space. Informal sector mortgages, India is a great example, I agree. And I think they have, I know also Mexico has done some work, SHF has done some work on informal sector lending. So at this point, I would say we are pretty comfortable financing mortgages that are being lent to informal sector buyers, and the technologies that are being used to measure credit risk and track the data necessary to make those credit decisions is pretty innovative and effective way of working with those clients in remote locations and smaller markets. I think the challenge for us in that really low income sort of entry level home buyer space is finding a developer who can deliver at scale, which is what you really need to do. If you're doing formal development of new housing, whether it's for rental or for sale, the developer needs to be able to manage a very efficient operation, and they have to be willing to use new technologies in order to achieve lower cost for delivering the product. And for us, they absolutely have to be familiar with global green building standards, because we need them to be energy efficient and resource efficient. So I've had people tell me on more than one occasion, it can be affordable or it can be green, but you can't have both. And I think nowadays that's not true. I do think the technologies exist so that you can do both. But I would say that aside from a handful of developers, certainly in India, large-scale developers are able to build smaller units at an affordable price, and that's very encouraging. In Africa and Latin America, it has been much more difficult to find developers who really will focus on that entry level. So in Honduras, for example, we have a project where the houses started at $10,000, and they were 37 square meters, very simple, concrete units. They're now selling for about $15,000. But to find a developer who's willing to build at that price a large number of homes with a small margin on each home and do it effectively according to our standards as a development bank is pretty difficult to do. So we're ready and willing. We just need the private sector partners.
That's good. So Madia, two things back to you. Just this idea of equitable policies. Can you speak a little bit on the recommendations to remain equitable? And then looking a little bit to a question, why are some of these policies not already being implemented by some of the governments? We know, for example, in COVID-19 response stimuluses that we've researched, I believe less than or around 10% of those policies have included something about housing. So can you speak to maybe why that's not being thought of, and then also this issue of equity as well?
Yeah, let me first speak a little bit about equitability. We already, Deborah already mentioned a lot. To be equitable, you really have to look at the housing sector from an inclusive perspective, that you are not leaving important parts of the population behind that during this particular health crisis needed most. Often, for instance, the informal sector is excluded, while when you look at it, informal construction on public land particularly, it would be very easy, because we know how to do this, to provide large-scale infrastructure and services to informal communities as part of a stimulus. But for one reason or the other, it's easy for the official developers to capture the ear of government. And most of the stimulus packages are nearly automatically geared towards the formal top-end developers. So the upgrading of informal areas on public land, which would be, very easy to do, doesn't make it often into the stimulus packages. The same is true for the rental sector. We do not see enough rental housing built. And not everyone in emerging markets, certainly not, can become a homeowner. Also, in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, in urban areas, 60 to 90% of the population are renters. So what do we do for them? How do we improve the rental sector so that that is more efficient? And it can be done because we have many small rental landlords that only require technical assistance, not only technical assistance and funding in order to create a lot of new housing units. Then, of course, we want communities to be involved, because when we go to the lower end of the market, it's very important to work with communities themselves. That is time consuming and not very easy. So being inclusive in a stimulus package that has to be rolled out in the short term is therefore a challenge, but not really when you put your mind to it. When I work with governments, and I do at the moment, I work with 4 governments on their stimulus packages. Then we sit down and we go over what can actually be achieved for that lower end of the market. It is just that it has been felt by government officials as too cumbersome, too late, too much to deal with at this point in time. But then when you discuss it and you open up the perspective of technical assistance and funding, very often you see that doors can be opened, and this sector can be included in the stimulus packages. So I'm hopeful that it can be done because I'm in the middle of it. So, yeah.
So we're getting several great questions. So I'm going to try to jump to one of those. And Madi, I think while we have you here, we're going to use the economist in the house to try to explain some things to us. So there's a good one, and it is, as Professor Hochschmidt defined, housing services. It is almost all paid to renters. Does Professor Schmidt have an estimate of the economic contribution or the multiplier of renter income, and perhaps the relative contribution of that renter income to other forms of spending on housing?
Yeah, the rental is actually the easy part of the consumption measurement, basically. Most governments do consumption and expenditure, income and expenditure surveys every year. And they include the amount that households spends on rent, on utilities. They ask from the owner households how much they think their house would rent for if it was rented out. So in many countries, in actually most countries, we have those surveys ready. And that material is actually available. In some countries, that part of owner-occupied rent is missed and is not included. And that is why the figures are lower than they should be in the estimates. But it normally can be done. I've done many demand surveys, for instance, in many countries on a national level, and people know the imputed rent if they are an owner. So we have rather reliable data. You can collect rather reliable data on that.
Thanks, Maria. So another one that I think this could be Ariel or Deval. So while the majority of informal income groups build incrementally, what efforts are required to address access to housing where developers aren't able or are less able to step in?
I would like to answer that or to share that. In the Mexican case, I think that an historical bias, maybe an error, is that in the housing public policy, ownership was the first target, the first objective. And it's not anymore the case in Mexico. And I think that the main two options that we need to face right now, one is rental, which is already happening in Mexico, but in my opinion, it will not be that easy, and maybe is medium term, because you need to change many things, not only the market, but also the legal framework. And the second one, that in my opinion is the one that we should address in the very short term as a counter-cyclical economical event, is the self-construction. And the problem is that, and I'm going to say in a very dramatic way, but the formal sector, the individuals who work in the formal sector, they buy houses through the mortgage. The individuals who perform in the informal sector, they self-construct, and they don't have any financial tools. They don't have credit. They just go for savings, personal savings. And I think that the challenge is there. I just want to recall the microbill initiative that took place with OPIC and Habitat for Humanity. That is maybe one of the best tools that we can use right now in order to provide a formal finance platform to micro lenders that they already exist. They are already serving that segment, not with a mortgage, but with a consumption loan, maybe with some or many inefficiencies, but they are serving those. We have that in the consumption loans, in the mobile loans, and maybe that's the kind of approach that we can take in order to move faster to serve this self-construction need, which is the Mexican reality, and I could assume that it will be the same in the emerging markets.
Thanks, Ariel. And Deval, you create these pretty unique homes in India that allow for incrementalism. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yes. See, I believe the biggest challenge in emerging markets is that when a person buys a home, it's usually a home for life, and they stretch themselves and buy it. Now, as in developed markets, it's not possible for them to, usually very difficult, if not impossible, to move to a larger home. So we see this opportunity that, if they could build incrementally for a fraction of the cost, they could improve their lives dramatically. At the other end of the spectrum, it could also create a sort of a secondary income for people. Now, we've seen this homes being extremely successful, and we've gone down. So my first pilot project was something that I was targeting to build homes at around $4,000, but we ended up doing something like $5,000 for an independent home. And through the period of that time, we did a couple of impact evaluations on them with the Rockefeller Foundation, with the Rand Corporation. And we found that we had people like landless laborers who actually were able to afford it. And it's the sweet spot is that $5,000, $6,000, $8,000. But they are not comfortable building or buying homes in high-rise structures or low-rise structures, because that's also not a part of their life. Second thing, that these independent homes are much better maintained, because that's a challenge that we deal with. Though you see a lot of degradation, I think I took you down to one of our sites which we did near Bombay, and we saw a bit more wear and tear than we expected over it. But overall, it's much better. Now, one more point I'd like to add in this is that when you're looking at projects of 50, 100, 200, 500 units, those are the ones that will create an impact, because when a person builds individually, it's very, very difficult for them to get economies of scale. And for that, the cost of capital for developers is to come down, which doesn't for small developers. It does for very large developers who are not in the space, but for the smaller developers working in this space across the world, the cost of capital is extremely high. So that's why you don't see a lot of developers coming into the what we do. Like I hardly know of anyone who does it in the western part of India. And just to take it ahead, we are partnering with other developers trying to scale this from a capital perspective.
Thanks, Duval. And also just after Ariel's mention of the microbuild fund, which was explained well, it's essentially a facility that allows for capital to lenders who then on lend to small builders for their incremental construction. But I just do want to share, we had just done some research with a market research firm in the Philippines, and they found that people who had been able to improve their homes shortly before the pandemic now found themselves more capable of home-based business and income than those who did not have access to that improvement. So it is just, again, a timely reminder of just a coping mechanism in the public health pandemic that we find ourselves in. So I think there's a question for Madia. How can NGOs influence regulatory authorities for making a favorable environment to link low-income housing with the formal financing sector?
Oh, I think NGOs, particularly those with a good track record in the housing sector, can have a major impact on government on the whole regulatory environment for construction, particularly on the side of the standards for housing, by showing how people actually live, how much space they actually occupy, and helping governments, particularly local governments, because regulations are nearly always in the realm of local government, to help them set standards that are not necessarily lower, but simply more efficient and have the same health outcomes and other outcomes as higher standards. So NGOs can also, and that is not quite directly on the regulatory side of standards, but help governments implement innovative institutions like community land trusts, where indeed the land remains in the hands of the community. But in order for, and therefore, you do not have this increase in land prices affecting house prices and making within short order the housing in well-located areas unaffordable for the people that live there. That is the idea behind that. Similarly, a cooperative structure can play this role. But you need strong NGOs that actually have staying power to continue to manage those new instruments for land management. And that is a critical role for NGOs. And in the United States, all these innovative land tools that we have are nearly all implemented by these strong NGOs, housing NGOs that we have. So the role of NGOs is critical because this cannot be done by local government, nor can it be done by the private sector. So there is an enormous space that has to be filled by housing NGOs, this staying power and knowledge. Yeah.
That's great. So we do have an actual question that I think is going to help us wrap up. And it is asking, where do we go from here with these findings? So I would invite everyone to provide some comments to that if you have any.
Well, I can perhaps start from my perspective. One of the challenges that we've had from the beginning is how we demonstrate impact in the projects that we finance. And with housing, it's particularly difficult because the jobs, normally we measure jobs. Well, the number of jobs created in a housing project are temporary jobs, so you don't get credit for that. If the entity that's financing the project is, an offshore vehicle of some kind, well, there aren't very many jobs associated with that, and it doesn't have physical presence that's measurable. So having this type of data, I think, would help us make a stronger case for the development reach, if you will, of housing projects, and how we can structure projects to get the most impact out of them. We're doing that already with green aspects and community social services. We're requiring targeting the lowest income group that we possibly can, that's feasible, where there's reasonable demand. But I think this type of economic data will put us in a position for advocating ourselves with local governments to make some of the changes that would catalyze a broader housing market, but also will help us internally measure the impact of our projects better.
Yeah, if I may come in right on that